Welcome to the webinar. This is Comorbidity and Gambling Disorder. This webinar is part of the Problem Gambling Services at Recovery Resources. We're excited to offer this training opportunity. During the webinar, you can raise your hand using your participants table or submit questions through the chat function. I'll monitor these during the webinar. Receive your CEU 1 hour after the webinar. You'll receive an email with a link to a brief test. Upon completion and passing of the test, you will automatically receive your CEU certificate. At Recovery Resources, we help people triumph over mental illness, alcoholism, drug, and other addictions. Our services range from mental health and addiction prevention and treatment to services to support individuals in recovery, such as housing and employment. We offer services to employers through our Employee Assistance Program, and finally, offer training and education similar to this webinar. To learn about further trainings, visit our Training Institute website on recres.org/education. We offer a variety of clinical and non-clinical trainings as well. I'll turn this over to your presenter, Mike Pizzelli, and enjoy.
Thank you, Ashley. Thanks everyone for joining our webinar. You're going to hear from me today, but then also two other colleagues of mine at Recovery Resources when we get a little more into the comorbidity and kind of what that is like. So again, who we are, I'm Mike Pizzelli. I'm the Gambling Services Coordinator here at Recovery Resources. And we're also going to hear from Christine Crisco, who is assessor here, and Katrina Holt, who is one of our agency gambling clinicians. So we'll hear from them a little bit later. So we have 3 poll questions throughout the webinar just to gauge kind of who all of you are. So our first question is, what part of the field best describes your work? And we'll wait for a few responses and see what we get. Ooh. All right, looks like most of us are in the treatment field, which sounds just fine because that's mainly what we're going to be focusing on. But other people are in prevention like I am, so it's always good to kind of understand these comorbidities. We often talk about more than just gambling disorder. If we are out in the community or at a school or university, oftentimes you need to be able to understand all these different whether they're mental health illnesses or addictions, other risky behaviors, because these coincide so often together. So it's good for prevention folks to understand that as well. And we offer other webinars on our website that are more focused on kind of integrating these addictions together for prevention folks. So our objectives today, we're going to discuss a little bit about the current climate of gambling and problem gambling in Ohio. We're going to discuss comorbidity. We're going to look at a few screening tools, and we're going to look at Recovery Resources gambling section of our assessment and share that with you a little bit. And then we'll wrap up with, again, talking with Christine and Katrina about kind of how assessment works here and integrating gambling and other addictions together in treatment. So the current climate. Gambling in today's culture, it's no longer compartmentalized. We don't need to travel to gamble like we used to. So people used to travel to Las Vegas or Atlantic City. That's no longer the case. And in history, only certain types of people gambled. These people were maybe looked at as risky or irresponsible. That's of course no longer the case. All types of people gamble, and we can pretty much gamble wherever we want. This is due to an increase in availability. So here in Ohio, we have multiple legal forms of gambling, from lotteries to casino gambling, that's table games and machines. We also have horse tracks. So we have a multitude of legal forms, but also popularity of illegal forms. Accessibility, 48 states have some form of gambling. I believe it's 36 now have casinos, so certainly big casino expansion over the past few decades. And then technology as well. We can do any type of gambling, on our smartphones, on our laptops. So it's literally at our fingertips whenever we need it. And then it's acceptable. It's more acceptable than maybe other forms. If we think about religious groups, charities, fundraisers, even education, 50-50 raffles at schools and athletics. So gambling is an acceptable form of not only entertainment, but just a form of fundraising too. So we just say that because it's so inundated in our culture for those reasons that it's acceptable, which makes it more available and accessible for us. Quick overview on some numbers. We spend about $120 billion a year on gambling. About 75% of Americans gamble on a yearly basis, and 15% gamble on a weekly basis. 6 to 8 million Americans meet criteria for gambling disorder, so this is gambling addiction. And another about 12 to 15 million are what we would call problem gamblers. So these individuals are starting to experience consequences due to their gambling behaviors. This could be financial consequences, relationship, employment, but maybe these individuals haven't met the threshold for a gambling disorder diagnosis. So we're looking at about 22 million individuals directly impacted by gambling behaviors, but then all of these individuals impact a number of other people, close family and friends, employers. So a very large number impacted by problem gambling. Let's move forward. So what is gambling? We have a couple definitions here. A simple one, risking something of value on an event that is determined mostly by chance. The DSM-5 states that gambling is risking something of value in the hopes of obtaining something of greater value. And then Gamblers Anonymous goes a little more in depth, talking about any type of betting or wagering for self or others, whether for money or not, no matter how slight or insignificant, where the outcome is uncertain or depends upon chance or skill. So Gamblers Anonymous gives us a very deep, understanding, overview of what gambling is, which makes sense, that being a 12-step abstinence-based organization. So, whether there's money being bet or not doesn't matter. It's the fact of, making the bet in and of itself is gambling. So problem gambling, this is when our gambling behavior disrupts or damages our mental or physical health. It also disrupts our emotional, social, and spiritual health. Can have consequences on our work, school, or other activities. Disrupts our relationships, our reputation, and of course, consequences with finances. Frequency and amount spent, so how often we gamble or how much money we gamble isn't necessarily a criteria for problem gambling. Those would be flags of severity that an assessor or a clinician would certainly talk about, but just because someone gambles, say 3 days a week, that doesn't necessarily define them as a problem gambler. It's whether these consequences come out of the behaviors is when we look at gambling as being a problem. So a little bit about the development. I mentioned earlier that, maybe in history, gambling was just seen as something maybe irresponsible or risky, often maybe even dealt with a religious authority if you thought you had a problem with gambling. Then it made its way into the DSM and DSM-4. It was an impulse control disorder. But now it is, we could classify it as gambling disorder in DSM-5. It's in the classification of substance-related and addictive disorders. So it's the only classified behavioral addiction. And similar to substance use disorders, it's in the same chapter. Mild, moderate, and severe are our severity levels. And you can see down there that internet gaming is in the DSM-5 in Chapter 3 under conditions for further study. Most likely when we move on to a DSM-6, that will probably be inside of this substance-related and addictive disorders as well. But why did this change happen? Why did we go from pathological gambling in DSM-4 to gambling disorder in DSM-5? Mainly comes out of reward center research, noting that gambling disorder affects the brain very similarly to disorders of substances. There are cravings and highs. There is a hereditary nature. But then also the treatment is very similar with cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational interviewing, but also 12-step programs. So GA, Gamblers Anonymous, and then there are Gamma Nons for the family and friends of gamblers. So the way we go about assessing, diagnosing, and treating gambling is, similar, if not the same, as any other substance. So another reason why we would make that move into having it be classified as an addiction. Here are the 9 criteria for gambling disorder. Preoccupation, so always thinking about it. Needing to gamble with increasing amounts of money, so building up a tolerance. Repeated and unsuccessful efforts to control, so a loss of control. Restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop the gambling, so withdrawal. So a lot of these should be overlapping the criteria of substance use. Gambling when distressed. Facing losses, so going back later that day or the next day to win back lost money. This can have a serious snowball effect, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Lying to hide the extent of involvement with gambling. This could be, lying about money lost, but just how often someone's going, trying to hide their gambling behaviors. Jeopardizing or losing opportunities, jeopardizing relationships, and then bailouts. So this is the last one, relying on others to provide money to relieve a desperate financial situation caused by gambling. So this isn't so much borrowing to gamble, but borrowing to, whether it's pay bills, buy groceries, so relieving a financial stressor that you can't afford because of gambling. And then there was a 10th criteria in the DSM-4, committing illegal acts. This is no longer a criteria, but still often discussed and considered, because this could certainly add information about severity level of gambling if someone's starting to commit illegal acts. Here you can see some specifiers for gambling disorder, and just showing attention to the bottom of the screen where we get into the severity levels. So this may look a little different than substance use, where substance use starts at 2 to 3 for mild. Gambling disorder doesn't start till 4 to 5. So you can see how those are a little different there. So mild for gambling disorder would be 4 to 5 criteria within a 12-month period, moderate 6 to 7, and severe 8 to 9 criteria. And again, all within a 12-month period, not lifetime. A little scope and impact. Some very new Ohio data shows us that a little more than 10%, it's 10.3% of Ohio adults have some level of risk for problem gambling. And those levels of risk are broken down there in raw numbers. So 571,000 at low risk, 271,000 at moderate risk, and then 76,000 at high risk, or what we could estimate that these individuals are probable disorder gamblers. So looking at about 76,000 probable addicted gamblers in Ohio. And these are Ohio adults alone. So a great number, I think a bigger number than what most people might think. We're looking at about 1 million individuals directly impacted by gambling behaviors. And this number has doubled since 2012. If you remember back, that is when our casinos and racinos started opening. So, not directly correlating that, but because of the availability of having many venues, we have 11 casino style venues, 7 racinos. So these are horse race tracks with lottery terminals, gaming machines, and then we have 4 casinos with slot machines and table games. So we have 11 casino style venues. Making this more available may make people that weren't gambling start gambling, and that may increase then problem gamblers. So this number has doubled since 2012. And the link down there, beforeyoubet.org, is the state campaign through Ohio for Responsible Gambling and Ohio Mental Health and Addiction Services. So that has a lot of great information, not only for Ohio alone, but also broken down into county-specific data, and then a lot of other nice tools for you to do. So I would visit that website and get a little look around there. So more about scope of gambling today. Our speed of play has drastically increased. So things like skill-based games on machines, so something like blackjack or poker on a machine as opposed to a table, and then also chance-based games on machines, so something like roulette can be played on a machine as opposed to the table. So this makes the game go a lot faster, so someone can maybe lose track of time or lose track of how many bets they're placing because of these games being played faster than they once were. Ohio has recently legalized daily fantasy sports. So again, this has been a big increase in play. Fantasy sports, whether it was baseball, football, basketball, etc., used to be played kind of in a season-long format as opposed to daily. So sorry about that screen there. So just the availability of being able to make bets daily as opposed to weekly or monthly in a season long, again, we can kind of lose track of how many bets we're placing. And then we're looking at a potential legalization of traditional sports gambling. So this is a court case in New Jersey right now that may overturn a federal ban on sports gambling. So Ohio may soon be voting or passing legislation on traditional sports wagering. So this is something that's kind of possibly coming down the pike that can, again, increase availability and potentially increase problem gambling here in our state. And I think an important point to make is that, as we know with any substance, earlier involvement may increase future problem severity. So early inundation is something to watch with gambling, because youth today are the first generation to be fully exposed to multiple forms of legal gambling. Again, gambling used to be compartmentalized. It was only done in certain places at certain times. This is no longer the case. When I was growing up here in Ohio, we didn't have casinos. We didn't have daily fantasy sports, things like that. So early inundation for gambling is something to be, I think, keep our eye on. And especially, again, I'm a preventionist. So, we talk with not only college students, but high school students and even down into middle school. Just again, when we're talking about risky behaviors in general, if we're talking about alcohol or drugs, even nicotine, to put in gambling education as well, because a lot of these risky behaviors are done hand in hand, so to speak. Some numbers of problem gamblers, about 70% commit illegal acts. These are typically money related. So whether it's fraud, theft, identity theft is a big one. 20% file for bankruptcy. There's a 20% divorce rate. 39% have suicide ideation, and then 20% attempt or die by suicide. So very high suicide rate, 1 in 5. This is the highest suicide rate of any addiction, typically attributed to not just the loss of finances, but other concerns that come from a loss of finances. So relationship issues, unmanageable debt, unemployment, and we have some further slides on that. Also correlated with high rates of domestic violence, accidents, and ER visits as well. We have a question over here. Not sure what that was. Here's a nice little web that I like looking at, kind of just showing kind of how a lot of these consequences, I think sometimes people maybe imagine that only financial consequences are related with gambling, but this is a nice web that kind of shows all of the consequences that come out and how they interplay, especially if we're looking at these financial and legal consequences, how they jump together, but then also the interpersonal ones. There's domestic and other violence, but looking at theft, imprisonment, but then asset losses, loan sharks, debts. So there's a lot of things that really go into this that I think sometimes people may not fully understand. And again, of course, we're going to be focusing on this in a little bit here. What are some of these comorbidities? Depression and anxiety are certainly at the top of the list for comorbid conditions with problem gambling. And here we go. So here's a quick little look at some of the more, I guess, more attributed comorbidities with gambling: alcohol use, personality disorder, nicotine dependence, any mood disorder, anxiety, drug use, and then again, that suicide attempt rate is very high. So I just like to include that as well. Here's a second poll question for you. When thinking, because we're going to go on and talk a little bit about integration of problem gambling into our services here at Recovery Resources. So just curious about if any of the agencies or organizations you work at, if gambling education, gambling literature has been integrated into anything. So this is, is gambling information integrated into the prevention services, treatment, literature. So just trying to get a gauge of that. So we're looking at about 55% no. So I guess it's good that we do have a big number of yeses, but the majority say no. So that's definitely something we hope to change. Recovery Resources offers all types of trainings for, it's whether it's just a training on gambling or specific maybe strategies how to integrate services. So please, if that sounds of interest to you, definitely let us know. So problem gambling and substance use. 15% of individuals with a substance use disorder also have problems with gambling. Just wanted to reiterate that kind of the telltale signs of addiction definitely play into gambling disorder. We saw this when we were looking at the 9 criteria for gambling disorder, but a large preoccupation with gamblers. So planning to gamble, what lie can I tell to get out of work early? What lie can I tell about why I'm home late? Planning to hide bills, all sorts of preoccupations. Tolerance, gamblers certainly build up a tolerance, needing to bet higher amounts of money and betting more often. Withdrawal, so sleep disturbances, headaches, nausea, shakes, so definitely some withdrawal symptoms. Restless, irritable when cutting down. Loss of control, so again, this inability to cut back or quit. And then consequences, and we've already heard a lot of the consequences that are associated with this disorder. Here's some triggers. So situations, people, places, or things can be a trigger, especially again, because gambling is so available and acceptable. So just think about all the ads we see, whether it's popping up on our phones or computers or billboards or commercials. Thoughts can be triggers for gambling disorder. So maybe I'm due today, or it's my birthday and I won last year on my birthday. Or one's about what could this hurt? Or, if I play one more time and win, I can pay back all the money I owe. So a lot of thoughts and cognitive distortions playing into these triggers. And then mood. So it could be anger, could be grief, joy, desperation. So moods can be triggers for us to gamble as well. Further triggers, chronic pain. A lot of people use gambling as medication. This could be physical pain, but also mental, emotional, depression, anxiety, PTSD. That's probably a webinar in and of itself, but strong correlations with gambling disorder and PTSD, especially among the veteran population. But also a recent addition of medications. So these aren't necessarily addictive behaviors, but more so side effects. So restless leg syndrome and Parkinson's are associated with problem gambling behaviors. If someone's on a Requip or Mirapex, both of these can attribute to not only problem gambling behaviors, but other compulsions, hypersexual, overeating, compulsive shopping. And then Abilify has gone as far as to have a black box warning stating that compulsive gambling behaviors are a side effect. So we would try to work with the healthcare field as well, letting individuals know about this. Some risk factors for cross addiction. Gambling can sometimes be seen as less harmful to the body, mind, or family than other substances. It can falsely be viewed as a distraction from using substances. It can be viewed as a way to finance substance use, but then also substance use can lead to poor judgment while gambling, and substances may be used to cope with the negative consequences of gambling. So you can see a lot of back and forth there. I keep getting questions. Oh, it's actually hard, I say. Here's an interesting, couple interesting results from a 2012 Ohio Problem Gambling Survey. This was conducted by Ohio Mental Health and Addiction Services before our casinos opened. And a couple interesting quotes there that you can read about gambling and substance use. But I wanted to highlight individuals in this study that were both diagnosed with problem gambling and alcohol use disorder. They were asked to rate their cravings from 0 to 90. And these individuals' average craving rating for alcohol was 35, but their average craving rating for gambling was 49. So a higher craving for gambling than alcohol amongst individuals in the study that had both gambling disorder and alcohol use disorder. So I thought that was interesting to highlight when thinking of when sometimes thinking that gambling severity is seen as less severe than the substances that we put in our body. So looking at gambling disorder and mental health, National Council on Problem Gambling in 2015 showing that while 5% of the general public is affected with depression, 50 to 70% of problem gamblers suffer with depression. And this can be explained in a number of ways. Depression may occur first, and gambling is the maladaptive coping mechanism. Or gambling may lead to depression with the development of debt, lies, loss of relationship, and other consequences. Or depression and gambling may present at the same time as a result of another underlying factor, such as a past trauma. And this can be seen again with PTSD. Gambling and severe mental illness. So why would an individual with a severe mental illness seek out gambling? It certainly can be seen as normal because a lot of people gamble. Going to a casino or a racetrack may create connections. These venues are open typically 24/7, 365. So they're always open, they're always available. You can create connections with maybe other players, other consumers, but also staff members. Gambling can relieve loneliness and boredom. And then gambling can also be seen as a substitute for employment. So maybe not so much winning money, but feeling useful and productive. So I'm earning money as opposed to winning money. What defines problem gambling among the mentally ill? Often this individual is betting little amounts of money. They may use gambling as medication. And also self-esteem and self-worth are often tied to and determined by the gambling. These individuals typically have money controlled by someone else in their life, so the financial damage may be minimal or less severe than someone without a mental illness that's gambling. Basic bills may be being paid for, may not have access to credit cards. However, the cognitive deficits may cause serious impairment and judgment in gambling, leading to some of the other consequences. So maybe the financial consequences aren't aren't as severe, but some of the other ones may be. Here's a little table of some other problems associated with gambling. You can see non-gambler, low risk, at risk, problem, and then pathological. So this is old language out of the DSM-4, but these numbers are still important to look at. I think one to look at, emotionally harmful arguments with family about gambling. You can see the high number there amongst pathological gamblers, 53% stating having emotionally harmful arguments. almost 14% job loss in the past year, 19% bankruptcy, 32% arrested. I also think it's interesting to look at that the problem gambler reported twice as much drug use in the past 5 days, or 5 days plus in the past year, than the pathological gambler. And that actually makes more sense when we're looking at a higher severity of gambling may bring about less substance use for the fact that most severe gamblers are not wanting to be impaired during gambling. So I think it actually makes sense that the problem gamblers identifying with more drug use than the pathological gamblers or the higher severity gamblers. More information that I said we discuss on the correlation between suicide and gambling disorder. So here's just a number of studies that all kind of found similar results. And what are those characteristics or variables of a disordered gambler that play into the high suicide rate? And we can see unmanageable debt, mental illness, unmanageable debt, unemployment, unmanageable debt, unemployment, mental illness, depression. So you see a number of these studies over the past few decades kind of all showing similar correlations and similar variables that lead to the high suicide rate amongst addicted gamblers. I'm going to look at some screening and assessment before we get into our discussion. So there's a number of gambling screens that can be used. At Recovery Resources, we use the brief biosocial gambling screen inside our assessment. And I'll go further into that, but there's also the South Oaks gambling screen, and it has a revision for adolescents. And then there's the DSM-5 based, and that has a one called the DSM-5J for juvenile as well. The live bet questionnaire is a very brief, only 2 question screen. The GA20, which we use in some of our literature, it's been at least described by individuals in GA to be kind of one of their turning points that made them go to a meeting or seek out treatment because of the specific questions they use. So that's a good one to look at. And then also the Canadian Problem Gambling Index. And this is a widely used screen, and this is the index that was used in the 2012 Ohio Problem Gambling Survey that I showed some results from earlier. The BBGS, so I wanted to focus a little more on that. The BBGS, again, the brief biosocial gambling screen, is based on lifetime, and there's 3 questions. It asks about withdrawal symptoms, it asks about hiding gambling involvement, and it asks about needing financial bailouts. If someone answers yes to any one of those 3, they would be considered at risk for problem gambling, and then a further assessment would be advised. And oftentimes we tell other agencies to then use the SOGS. It's a further 20-question assessment that can give more, I guess, in-depth analysis about the potential problematic behavior. A full assessment would discuss much more. Of course, gambling initiation, the progression, frequency and severity. It would discuss debt, types of gambling, which may be important, the types of gambling done, reasons for gambling, consequences, reasons for being here now, their motivation to change, and then assessment of suicide risk. And assessing suicide risk should be done in every assessment, but also every time you're with a client because of that high suicide risk. And we recently did a training with the Ohio Problem Gambling Helpline, and the operators of those phone calls to also make them more comfortable and give them more strategies to assess suicide risk for when they're discussing the behavior with a caller who calls into that helpline. Here is an image of part of the Recovery Resources gambling assessment. I think one thing to look at, it's always been a barrier when discussing gambling with individuals who are first in an assessment, because you really have to be clear on what gambling is. So a lot of people in the community may not associate certain types of gambling as actual gambling behaviors. When we look at things like lottery or scratch-off tickets, those are very normalized in our culture, especially because the amount of money that can be wagered essentially can be very low, right? As little as $1. So oftentimes individuals may not associate that with gambling. So someone may buy a lottery ticket every day, but when asked, do you gamble, they may say no, because they don't view that as gambling. So you can see our first three questions there kind of categorize different types of gambling: lottery, scratch off, bingo, raffles. We ask about casino style gambling. Then we also ask about sports gambling, fantasy sports, online, things that are starting to get more popular now, to kind of let people know that when we're asking about gambling, these are all considered gambling behaviors. The next three highlighted there are the BBGS questions. So again, asking about withdrawal symptoms, asking about trying to hide your involvement, and then asking about needing bailouts. Going a little further here, these highlighted 9 are the DSM-5 questions. So again, 4 to 5 would be mild, 6 to 7 moderate, and 8 to 9 severe. And then the very bottom question there is that if these are better explained by a manic episode, and someone in going through or experiencing a manic episode and showing these or endorsing these criteria would not be sufficient for a gambling disorder, but I'm going to let some more experts discuss that in a little bit here. And then we have a spot where an assessor can fill in a summary of the client's gambling. So whether that's age of first use, last use, and we also have initiated a prevention class for someone who may not meet the threshold of 4 criteria. Maybe they're endorsing 2 or 3. They could write a note in there that a prevention class or an education class on problematic gambling behaviors may be a good idea for this potential client to engage in. So I can move over here closer to you folks. So we're going to bring in again our special guests. Christine and Katrina are an assessor and a clinician at Recovery Resources, and we're going to ask them just a couple questions and hopefully get a little more information about what it's like integrating services and the whole process. So I'm going to start with, do you guys want to introduce yourselves first? Say your name and maybe what you do, how long you've been here.
I'm Christine Frisco. I've been here for about 3 years, and I do diagnostic.
And I'm Katrina Holt. I have been full-time Recovery Resources for about a year now, but I was also an intern here for 9 months before that. I do a lot of our gambling counseling, and I also do behavioral health counseling and run an outpatient group.
Thank you. Do you have any questions for Christine? You can write them in the chat, and then our introductory person actually we can hear.
Can I hear him?
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Can you hear us now? I heard that the mic went off a little bit. Hopefully everyone can hear us. We will, I'll do a quick introduction again. We just have Christine, who is a diagnostic assessor at Recovery Resources, and Katrina, who's a gambling clinician, and we're just going to ask them a few questions. And if you guys have questions for either myself or them, you can write them in your chat box there, and Ashley can read them off to me, and hopefully we'll get some questions answered. But I'm going to start with Christine because she's the assessor, and that's where the whole process starts. So, Christine, what challenges do you face most often when asking about gambling during an assessment? Because we often hear that, you know, someone comes in for a different problem, right? Something else going on in their life, but we start asking them about gambling. So what are some challenges you face during those conversations?
One of the things that tends to be difficult is just the way that this particular assessment at Recovery Resources is set up. It's towards the end of the assessment. Sometimes clients just don't want to talk about it anymore. They're kind of over the entire assessment process, no matter how long it takes. But even if the gambling part was at the beginning, then it's like, okay, they're not really comfortable with us yet. So it's never a great place for the gambling information to come into the conversation. Another issue that I know has come up multiple times with assessors is that it seems like if somebody's coming in for substance use, and especially if they've been clean for a little bit and not an extensive amount of time, but it's like I've heard so many times, oh, well, now that I am not spending all my money on drugs, like maybe I can go and start gambling. And it seems kind of funny, but they're pretty serious. And sometimes it's concerning because we think that we're putting the thought into their head. Like, oh, I've never really thought about this before, but now I have all this time and money available. Let's go do it. Something that you were talking about a little while ago was the criteria, just helping the clients understand all the different forms of gambling, helping them understand what it means to endorse any of the stuff that's in the DSM-5. A lot of people don't view what they're doing as gambling. So it's not really our job to convince them that what they're doing is gambling, but maybe putting that thought into their head. Yes.
In the end, of course, for the assessor as well. I think that's what we try to do. All right, we're back. So that's station identification special. We're back. We were just discussing that trying to narrow the questions as much as possible. I think one thing that was good to narrow the questions, also let clients know what gambling is how we kind of categorize them as opposed to do you gamble or do you play bingo? Yes or no? Do you go to the casino? Yes or no? Do you play yes or no? That would be pretty tiresome. Kind of categorizing them limits the questions, but also lets them know.
Could they hear Christine? Yeah. Where's your phone here?
Can you hear me now?
Are we doing the old Verizon wireless commercial? Is it good now, everyone? Jeez. Hello, everyone. I hope we are back, and I hope you can hear me. We're getting some thumbs up. Okay, fantastic. So again, just narrowing the questions is a great idea. It categorizes them to let clients know what gambling is, but also limits the amount of questions. And I think putting the idea of gambling in someone's head can be a concern. You know, if someone is no longer using a substance or alcohol, they have more money in their pocket, and they also have more time from not using. So a perfect place to spend time and money is a gambling venue, right? So that is a concern, I think. Are you noticing, Christine, any trends in the criteria? Is there maybe a criteria that people are endorsing more often than others?
I actually spoke with multiple other assessors here just to get a general idea. And there was 3 of the criteria that were most often endorsed. The first one being becoming more restless or irritable when they're not able to gamble or they're completely cutting back. Returning to chase their losses, like, okay, I can go back, I'm gonna do this, like I'm gonna earn my money back. And then the third one being lying to keep it from family members or friends, which seems to be related a lot to the second one that I said of like they're going to even it out so that maybe they can still hide it. They don't have to worry about that because they're not going to get caught. Another thing that was definitely brought up was a lot of people have been banning themselves from the casinos. That's not a criteria, but it's a trend that we've been noticing. But a lot of people have also been very honest with saying that even though they ban themselves from one particular place, they're still going elsewhere.
Or they continue to go to that casino as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I think I think a lot of that's really interesting. I think the fact that people are endorsing the withdrawal symptoms often shows again the severity of gambling disorder, that there are these withdrawal symptoms that happen even though you're not necessarily putting something in your body. I thought what you said was about kind of the interplay between hiding and chasing was really interesting, that someone they're hiding their involvement, but then they may chase not only to win their money back, but if they chase and do win that money back, then they can hide their losses, right? So I think that's a really interesting interplay there, that they kind of go back and forth. And again, chasing losses also, leads to, discussions of misconception of odds and luck and chance. People thinking they have more of a chance to win that money back than maybe they really do. And then the VEP, the Voluntary Exclusion Program, yes, people can ban from Ohio, but there's certainly many casinos around Ohio, in Detroit, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Erie, Pennsylvania. So there's close places that they can go. Fortunately, for some of the gambling companies, if you exclude from their casino in Ohio, you're excluded from the other ones in other states. So they do have corporate exclusion as well. So that is something that the industry tries to help out with. But as Katrina pointed out, just because you exclude doesn't mean you're not still going to try to go get in there. So people do go in, and some of them do have legal consequences because of that. Then can you touch just lastly on the manic episode and a little bit about when someone's endorsing these criteria during a manic episode, why that's not sufficient to diagnose a gambling disorder?
So if somebody is experiencing a manic episode, they typically are experiencing some loss of judgment. They get involved in a lot more high-risk things that they wouldn't typically be doing. And a very significant portion of the time, it tends to be gambling. At least that's what we're seeing anyway. So if they're doing that it doesn't quite match up, because those are things that they wouldn't typically be doing. When somebody's gambling, it does look a lot like mania as well. So that's something that's very hard to pull out of the client. So if you were to diagnose both the mania or bipolar and a gambling disorder, the person would need to very clearly and distinctly be engaging those behaviors when they're manic, as well as when they're not manic. And I would just very strongly recommend talking to somebody that's very closely interacting with them consistently to find out if there really is a distinction, because a lot of people don't see it either.
Great, thank you very much. I think a good lead from, thanks. I think a good lead into then discussing with Katrina about comorbidity is, so Christine talked about, people are coming in for assessments for other things, or maybe they're, haven't built rapport with the assessor, they're not comfortable, or maybe they're just they're just tired and done with it by the time gambling questions come up if they're at the end of an assessment. So we started something where we are having our group clinicians every few weeks have a 15 or 20-minute discussion about gambling with their groups. And then we re-screen these individuals in the group. And we're seeing that some are starting to endorse some of those gambling criteria. So whether this is they've been in treatment for a while, so they're starting to, you know, create more behavior change, or maybe after learning a little bit more about problem gambling from the counselor, they take a look at their behaviors and think maybe this is something I want to work on. So we've instituted that. So I wanted to ask Katrina not only about those gambling conversations we're having, but just why in general it is important to discuss gambling in a typical IOP group setting or with another individual client.
So we come to, it's partially, we already talked about it a little bit. Once people get clean from what they initially came here for, they start engaging in other problematic behaviors that we might not have noticed before, or they, like what was mentioned earlier, have more time, have more money. They look at it as something that's okay because it's legal. They don't really notice that the symptoms of problematic gambling are similar to their substance use disorder. So it's important to just kind of get them to realize that that is a problem. It can have even more detrimental consequences than their substance use in some situations. And they're unaware of that addiction transfer.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one thing definitely is that there may not be, other than maybe losing a lot of money quickly, a night out gambling, there may not be as many real quick or imminent consequences. When you're looking at gambling disorders, some of those consequences are more down the line as opposed to something that may happen quicker if when you just think about passing out or even something like an overdose with a substance use, that doesn't happen with a gambler. So to Katrina's point, they may not notice the consequences to be as severe, or maybe just not notice the consequences at all until maybe too late. Are there any comorbidities you see more often? Or do you think, why do you think someone with a comorbidity might seek out gambling?
So I see more anxiety and depression with my behavioral health clients when I talk to them about gambling. In the group setting, since I'm in an outpatient group, their substance use disorders aren't necessarily as extreme. So I haven't seen a lot of comorbidity of, substance use and gambling. But with my behavioral health clients, I definitely do, because they're looking for some sort of relief in some way or another to get, their anxiety away, to, lessen their depression. And it's something where they sometimes feel more comfortable at the casino than any other place. They feel comfortable. Yeah, they feel comfortable there. And so that's like it. And Christine talked about the mania a little bit, which is kind of hard to determine, but I do see more manic behaviors when they talk about their gambling or when they're actually in the casino.
Okay, so looking at potentially the casino almost being, for some people, at least we'll call them social gamblers, non-problematic gamblers, casinos can be very overwhelming. There's a lot going on, right? The sights and the sounds, it's very exciting. It's very activating. But you're saying that maybe for some individuals, some of these PH clients with anxiety and depression, the casinos are comfortable. Maybe the gambling, maybe whether you're at a machine or at a table, kind of getting involved in the game can decrease the depression, decrease anxiety. But then is there the possibility that, right, whether it's loss of finances or other consequences, then that kind of plays into just like a vicious cycle of then just creating more potential anxiety, especially the loss of finances can be a real, build up some anxiety.
And that's why that is one of the more important reasons why we have to bring it up in the groups, because they go, just like he said it's a vicious cycle. They go looking for relief, but in the end, I mean, it could take a very short amount of time where they're starting to see those negative consequences from going. And so giving them that knowledge of, well, you might get that relief for, you know, that couple of hours, but what is that going to look like in the long run?
So I guess to kind of close up, and then we'll look at some questions they have. Why did you get involved in problem gambling treatment? Is there something that, kind of drove you to it? Did you find it interesting? Was it just maybe another training, but then you found it interesting and wanted to pursue it further? Tell me just a little bit about, I guess, your initiation into it and why you've, kind of carried it out.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. As an intern with Recovery Resources, I was lucky enough to go to our trainings, and, in school, we learned about how gambling is the only non-substance use related disorder in the DSM. So it's one of those up and coming things that you want to be on the forefront of. We're one of the only places that has this treatment program. And so I just wanted to make sure that I was well-rounded on everything. With all the changes that are coming, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And so there aren't a lot of providers. So I just wanted to be a part of something that is going to be on the forefront of that.
Thank you very much. So I'm looking at some questions we had from the audience. Why isn't gambling treated like substance abuse if there is such a high suicide rate? So I'm thinking that the word treated is being written as like looked at. Why isn't gambling looked at as severe as substance use when there's that high suicide rate? I think something especially that I encounter when I'm out in the community trying to discuss problem gambling is that, we're living in this opioid epidemic right now, and similar to just what we were talking about, maybe the consequences don't come as fast with gambling as they do with substances. With all these correlations and all these similarities between gambling disorder and substance use disorder, there are many differences as well. And one of the big differences is that there's no intoxication, so I can gamble all night, and there's no right. I'm not gonna overdose. I can take out as much money as I have in my ATM, right? But my body's not going to reject that. So the large number of overdoses and deaths we're seeing attributed to substances now, you don't necessarily see that with gambling. Now, again, there's a 1 in 5 suicide rate, which can be attributed. So there may still be a high death toll, but it's just not looked at the same. We have a coalition, Cuyahoga Problem Gambling Coalition. A lot of our community advocacy is related around trying to increase the awareness of the severity of problem gambling, and we definitely take that into account. Do we treat men and women in separate groups? We do not. We treat men and women. There are both men and women in our, so for instance, in one of Katrina's groups, there'd be both men and women. How and why do you get banned from the casino? So what we mentioned about banning is the voluntary exclusion program. So this is for an individual who is noticing that their gambling is getting out of control and they voluntarily exclude themselves. So they ban themselves. In Ohio, we have a 1-year ban, a 5-year ban, and a lifetime ban. So the lifetime ban can't be overturned. 1 year and 5 year can be overturned, but it's not simply the 1 or 5 year anniversary date and you can just stroll back in. There is a reapplication process. You have to describe you ban in person and you reapply in person. So you discuss behavior change. You discuss that things and steps that you've taken maybe to gain control of your gambling, and then the casino can decide if they want to reinstate you or not. But individuals can be banned from the casino. This is more for things like conduct, cheating, things like that. Has anyone ever associated gambling with people dealing with grief? Absolutely. I don't necessarily have statistics on that, but right off the top of my head when I read that question was gambling in the older adult. Many gamblers, especially females, women that are older adults, will start gambling with the loss of a spouse. But grief could be attributed to loss of a loved one. It can be attributed to loss of a fulfilling career. So older adults who are going through these life transitions often pick up gambling when they never have before. And again, similar to why someone with a severe mental illness may seek out a casino. They're open, they're safe, you can create connections. So someone dealing with grief could absolutely find solace in gambling. So we try to discuss that as well. And one last one, I was asked to restate the Abilify comment. So Abilify has a warning on it that states that a side effect can be compulsive gambling. So we try to work a lot with the healthcare field, whether it's doctors, nurses, letting people know that. And so a healthcare provider should know that prescribing Abilify for someone with depression, to let that person know that problematic gambling behaviors can come out. To finish up, we have one last poll. Yes? No. If you have further questions that you want answered, please reach out to Recovery Resources, and we can answer those questions for you, whether phone or email, either is fine. For the last poll question, have you heard of the Cuyahoga Problem Gambling Coalition? And hopefully 100%, because I just mentioned it. The coalition? Yeah, a little bit more about the coalition. Sure. We started the coalition in 2014. It's a community group, so anyone from the community can join. It's made up also of a lot of professionals, prevention, treatment. We have law enforcement, we have lawyers, we have educators, but then we also have people who have been in recovery, and we also have family members of disordered gamblers. So it's a really great group. We put on a lot of community trainings and events. Our biggest event is our June symposium we do every year. However, we're not doing it this year. We're doing a different event because the national conference on problem gambling is coming in July. But we do a number of events. The one I mentioned earlier about training the Ohio Problem Gambling Helpline, that was through our coalition. But again, if you're interested, please reach out. We can give you more information. We have bi-monthly meetings, so there's only 6 month meetings a year, so we don't take up too much of your time. But again, just a lot of community events for advocacy, for training opportunities. Here's our vision and mission and our nice little logo there. And that concludes our webinar on gambling and comorbidity. So thank you for your participation, and thank you, Christine and Katrina, for some really nice, deeper insight into working with clients. And take care. Have a great week. Enjoy the weather. If you're in Cleveland, you could be anywhere. Thank you.